Hey there, folks. Welcome to Israel Explained. And we finally have a happy edition after Israel managed to rescue four hostages after so many bad days. Those hostages are Noah Argamani, Almog Meirjan, Andrei Kozlov, and Shlomo Ziv. And they're all back and safe, rescued from captivity by the IDF, along with forces from the Shabak and from the Israeli police commando unit, the Yamam. So we're going to look at the repercussions of this rescue. We're going to look at what it means politically, but mostly let's just enjoy the day and talk about this amazing operation. One of the most successful Israeli military operations of all time. I would say, here's what we know about the operation. So it was approved at 11 a.m. on Saturday, but it had been planned since Thursday. On Thursday, Israeli intelligence assets in Gaza, human intelligence, then corroborated by drone intelligence, showed that the four hostages were being held in two different buildings in the Nuseirath refugee camp. The two buildings were a few hundred yards away from each other. Um, Andre, Shlomi, and Almog were on the third floor of their building. Meanwhile, Noah was on the first floor of her building. The forces approached not through aid trucks or through the pier or anything else you might have heard. They approached coming in through the border disguised as Arabs. If you watch Fauda, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This is what we call in the Israeli army mista'arvim, Israeli soldiers who pretend to be Arab civilians. As they approach closer, and having guns in Gaza is not exactly um, something that will raise suspicion, they waited to hear on the radio that the coast was clear and ready for their attack. There were drones circling, looking at the two buildings, waiting for the best moment for attack. Now, the attack had to be simultaneous in both buildings because otherwise, we're talking about a very small area. If the people in one building know that another building has been attacked, they will immediately start moving the hostages elsewhere. Every so often, I don't know how often yet, but not too rarely, the hostages would be moved from place to place. That's one of the reasons it's been difficult to locate them until now. So they wanted to strike before they were moved, and they needed to strike simultaneously. The units that were used were the 7th Armored Brigade, the Sal Migolan Armored Brigade. They provided cover and cleared the perimeter. The 35th Paratroopers Brigade, the 900th Kfir Brigade, and the ones who did most of the difficult hand-to-hand fighting were the elite police Yamam commandos. Now, the two apartments, I guess it had to be attacked at one time. Um, and the apartment with Na Argamani in it had a much easier path to get her out. So it's possible that no shots at all were fired, or very few shots were fired, because Noah told her family that she was shocked to hear knocking on her door from the IDF saying, "This is the IDF. We've come to take you out." Things weren't so simple in the other apartment with the three guys. Over there, they were met with fire, and Arnon Zamora, one of the commandos in the Yamam unit, was killed. The IDF says he was killed because he marched at the head of the force. And that, of course, reminds us all of Yoni Netanyahu, who marched at the head of the force in Entebbe. And he will be, I think, remembered in the same breath as that hero and the brother of the current prime minister. Now, this had all started at 11. By 11:20, because there was fierce resistance at one of the apartments with the three guys, by 11:20, the entire neighborhood of Nuseirath was aware of what was happening. Hundreds of armed men with Kalashnikovs and RPGs converged on the marketplace. Now, the two apartments were um, verging on the marketplace, and the area between them was the market. And in order to get them out, they had to go through the market using two armored vehicles that had been brought in. Um, the two vehicles were under fire because Noah, her rescue had gone much more smoothly. She managed to get out without any problems. But the three in the car, because they were delayed, their car took direct hits from Kalashnikovs, possibly from RPGs. It was a very tense moment, just like in a movie. But the IDF had already prepared a rescue plan for if things go south. So immediately, the Air Force was called in, helicopters, fighter planes, in order to create a pathway so that the armored car containing the hostages could get out of the center of the marketplace. A helicopter landed in the middle of a relatively open area, and they needed special clearance to do this. You're usually not allowed to land the Israeli helicopter in enemy territory and rescue them. They managed to get out, all the hostages managed to get out without being injured at all. A few soldiers were injured in the operation, but it was an incredible success. So it was Ugda 98 forces that came to the rescue, covered by assault helicopters. Now, as you see, there were Palestinian casualties, some of which were terrorists and some of which were civilians. We don't know the exact number. Al Jazeera and Hamas say it's around 200 and something. I don't believe those numbers. And I'm sure that the majority of them, or a large number of them, are combatants. But that doesn't mean that women, children, civilians weren't killed. After all, the combat took place in the Nuseirath marketplace. But the heavy combat only took place once the escape had been performed. So we're talking about Hamas forces, possibly other terrorist organizations as well, trying to kill the hostages and the soldiers rescuing them before they got away. So it was that battle where they were killed. So people are blaming Israel for civilians being killed. Need to remember three things. How did these civilians get here? Well, they were kidnapped by Hamas. Second, why were there civilian casualties? For two reasons. Hamas kept them in the most heavily populated area imaginable, a marketplace in a refugee camp. And then, once they'd gotten away, instead of letting them get away, they began a massive firefight in the middle of the marketplace. Those three events led to the deaths of any Palestinian civilians. So I will never celebrate the death of any Palestinian civilians. But the idea that this was some kind of massacre or some kind of war crime or something else like that, when Hamas had done everything they could to put civilians in the line of fire while taking Israeli civilians hostage, just the thought that this is Israel's fault and they did something wrong is ridiculous and outrageous. And I usually am very careful and worried about Palestinian civilians. I am this case too. It's not Israel's fault that any of this happened. Now, this operation was so sophisticated and so successful. One of the reasons was the IDF managed to build models of these apartments and the access to them, and the forces that went to rescue them trained with built models of these apartments, exactly the way the IDF had done with the Entebbe rescue. Sometimes the old ways are best. Not everything needs to be technology. Just build a model and you assault it. That way you know the corners, you know where to expect fire from, and you're ready. And that's essential because you don't have time to be discovered. If you're discovered, the hostages can be killed in the blink of an eye. And somehow they managed to prevent that from happening. The IDF also noted the quality of the military intelligence and the intelligence that Shin Bet provided for them. And they said that that made the difference since, quote, there is a hair's breadth between failure and success in this kind of operation. After all, one false move could have gotten the hostages killed. And I spent all day watching Israeli TV, and the broadcasters have all been absolutely an emotional mess, choking back tears. And no one who's not Israeli can fully understand what it's like for us on this day, how we all vouch for each other and care about each other's lives so deeply. And that's why these hostages have been all we've been able to talk about for months. And now that some of them are out, we can breathe a little bit more easily, but we won't be able to breathe completely easily until they're all out. We vouch for each other. Israelis care about each other's lives. Netanyahu said, quote, once again, we have proven that Israel does not surrender to terrorism, and its acts of creativity and boldness know no bounds when it comes to bringing home our hostages, end quote. And indeed, this is the most outstanding Israeli rescue operation in decades. And Netanyahu was right to be proud of it. I only wish he would take as much responsibility for his failures as he takes for his successes. Yeah. So there are ramifications for this. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. This is the Middle East, and it's a complex place. So Hamas hasn't really reacted to this all that much, but Abu Obadiah, the spokesperson for the Izzadin al-Qassam brigades, that's the armed wing of Hamas, said, quote, the operation poses a great danger to the hostages and will have a destructive effect on their conditions, end quote. Now, we don't know if they mean that or if that's a threat to stop Israel from rescuing, but they probably mean it. I think in many cases, they've kept hostages outside of the tunnels because the tunnels are dangerous and they're more likely to get killed there. And it looks like they got a little bit complacent keeping them in apartments, thinking that because they were highly populated, the IDF would have trouble getting there. And they did. So they might end up being in tunnels, more of them. And we don't know how many are still alive. But the next rescue, if there will be one, will probably be harder. I think the fact that Israel hadn't committed a rescue for so many months made them a little bit complacent. But hopefully, they don't treat the hostages any worse than they already have. We're hearing they treated these hostages very badly, and the full details of how they were treated will probably not come out for months, as they did in previous cases when we talked about sexual assault, torture, etc., etc. No one talked about that when they first came out. It takes time for people to start talking about that, for reports to start coming out. But hopefully things don't get even worse. Now, we have to talk a little bit about the politics. Not the most important thing, but the politics here are essential. If you remember, Benny Gantz was supposed to quit the government today. He had given an ultimatum that if by today the government didn't pledge to a strategy to pursue the war more coherently, he would leave the government. And the government has absolutely not pledged a strategy to fight more coherently, but he hasn't left the government. And this is what happened. There was a press conference scheduled for today. On Thursday, when Israel decided to go on this operation, Gantz was updated. Being a very responsible man, he decided not to cancel his press conference so that Hamas wouldn't think that something was amiss. Hamas was waiting for him to leave the government. They follow Israeli politics very closely. So he just kept it going as it was supposed to be in order to mislead Hamas. Once the hostages were safely out, he canceled the press conference. He had no intention of leaving today. But this doesn't really change the big picture. Netanyahu still doesn't have a strategy for the war. He doesn't have a plan to get the rest of the hostages back. This was an attack of opportunity. He doesn't seem to be able to or want to. It's much more complicated than just one or the other. It's very difficult to get a hostage deal, but he doesn't seem able to get a hostage deal either. Netanyahu used this opportunity where all Israelis are overjoyed, including myself, including Gantz, including everyone, um, to make a political call to Gantz, which I think there's emotion behind it too, but it's also calculated. Netanyahu tweeted the following. He said, this is time for unity, not division. We must stay united as we face the big missions ahead of us. I call on Benny Gantz. Do not leave the emergency government. Do not give up on unity. Gantz gave a speech. He welcomed the operation and he said, quote, alongside our joy at the achievement, we need to think about how we move forward. But he also noted the challenges and problems, quote, remain as they were, which means the things that made me want to leave the government haven't changed. He seems likely to leave the government anyway, but he doesn't want to leave on the day that this happened. That would be anticlimactic and seem petty. He did seem to leave a tiny bit of a crack open in that statement for Netanyahu to change things. If he really means it, if he really wants Gantz to stay in, make Gantz feel like a partner, give him a strategic plan, start working together. Do I believe Netanyahu is going to do any of that? No. But if he really wants to save this coalition government, if he really wants the backing of the Israeli people in the rest of this war, take the momentum from this operation and turn it into a moment of unity. Because if he plays his cards right, he can regain a lot of the unity we had on October 7th or on October 8th from this moment. I just hope that he does. Now, as far as the hostage negotiations, this will probably not have a good effect on the hostage negotiations in the short term. Hamas will probably say, we're not going to negotiate now, or something like that. It's only a matter of time until they say something like that. But Israeli sources, intelligence, military, government, everyone agrees that a deal was so unlikely to begin with because of the differences between Hamas and Israel over whether we're ending the war permanently or a lasting ceasefire and all that stuff, that it doesn't matter. Hamas was going to say no. And even if Hamas was going to compromise in some way, Israel would probably say no. So the chances were close to zero. In the long term, this is probably good for the negotiations. Not tremendously good, but a little bit good. Why? Because it undermines their main asset, the hostages. Every hostage that dies, and Israel knows it dies, every hostage Israel releases undermines their advantage in negotiations. All Hamas really has that Israel wants is the hostages. They don't really have anything else. Israel has a lot that Hamas wants, which is the end of the war. This undermined that and also created a sense of doubt in Hamas because, like I said, there was complacency in the way they were holding on to these hostages. They thought Israel couldn't get them. Now Israel's shown that it can get them in places Hamas didn't expect. And so they feel vulnerable. And this will increase the odds of a deal in the long term. And Israel should probably follow this up, not probably, definitely follow this up with an increase of military operations. My choice would be retake Han Yunis. And of course, you know my opinion, start building an alternate government. But that seems to be a fantasy of mine and not something Netanyahu will ever do. Nonetheless, this is a great moment, not only for the families of the hostages and the state of Israel, but also an opportunity to regain the initiative in the war, to regain some of the unity, to put pressure on Hamas and get a better deal. Maybe even move towards victory. Maybe I'm just feeling optimistic today because of the operation, but all of Israel is feeling optimistic, and that can't be a bad thing. Okay, I have a bunch of questions from last time. Most of them are not relevant to this operation, but they're still interesting questions. Mike 990 asks, what's the game plan if Netanyahu blows up the deal? Do we go back into Khan Yunis, increase the bombing campaign? Surely he can't just blow up the deal and then continue business as usual, talking about Netanyahu. If the status of the hostages is grim at best, what's the downside to going back in? So this question takes on a new meaning after this operation. Um, right now, Israel seems to have a little bit of the initiative. Hamas seems to be a little bit on the back foot. It's important to use this to change the momentum in the war. You mentioned Han Yunis, Mike, in this question. That's exactly what I would do. I would take Han Yunis without leaving Rafah and increase the Israeli presence in Gaza. If Israel has Gaza, Han Yunis, and Rafah, and starts moving towards replacing the government and has also rescued hostages. Meanwhile, unfortunately, other hostages are dying. Hamas's leverage is getting lower every day. And that's the kind of dynamic Israel wants to create. Going to Han Yunis will help with that. James Burton asks, the only way this ceasefire deal gets signed is if Gvir and Smotrich agree to it. Can you see them agreeing at all? What if Bibi says to them, stay for stage one, promising to restart the war in stage two? Okay, this is a very astute question, James, because you're absolutely right. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are not going to agree to it. At best, they would stay through stage one, like you said. I don't think they would do that either. Um, no one trusts Netanyahu. No one in the world trusts Netanyahu. Okay, even his wife doesn't trust him after some incidents that happened. way back when. And that means Hamas doesn't trust him, Ben Gvir doesn't trust him, and Smotrich doesn't trust him. So when he tells them what he's going to do after stage one, no one believes him. If he tells Hamas he's going to continue in the talks, they don't believe him. If he tells Smotrich and Ben Gvir he's going to stop at that point, they don't believe him. No one believes him. So that's the reason Ben Gvir and Smotrich probably wouldn't wait till the end of phase one. They would probably leave because they don't want to be implicated in this. In election time, they want to be able to outflank Netanyahu on the right. So what that means is if Netanyahu was going to go through phase one, he would need to depend on Gantz and depend on Lapid. And that's a bet that I don't think he's going to take. And that's just one of the reasons it doesn't look like there's going to be a deal. The other, Sinwar seems to want the deal less than Netanyahu does. So when those, the bride and the groom don't want a marriage, you're not going to get a wedding. That's the situation. Tony asks, thanks for the great coverage. Thank you, Tony. By the way, so many of you have been giving me compliments, and I don't quote them on air because I don't want to be all, patting my own ego, but thank you for the compliments. They mean a lot to me. I take a lot of abuse online. I take a lot of abuse for what I do from Zionists, from non-Zionists, but so many of you give me compliments, and so many of you give me good feedback or positive, constructive criticism. I like that too. And thank you so much for that. But anyway, let's get back to the question. Tony says, a couple of questions. Is the IDF equipped to fight on two fronts? Do you think there's a scenario in which the situation in the north is so bad the cabinet chooses to halt the Gaza war and confront Hezbollah? And would that make a hostage deal more likely? Okay, so let's get things straight. The IDF isn't fighting on two fronts. It's fighting on three fronts. The West Bank right now is an absolute powder keg. Israel's operating there every night, and the PA is on the verge of disintegration, so that might become a full front, and that's the issue. I think the IDF can fight on two fronts. I don't think it can fight on three, and that's where the weakness comes, especially since each one of those campaigns requires a different focus, especially Lebanon is a completely different focus. And Avi Dichter said recently that Israel's not a superpower. It can't fight on every front, and the military is under a lot of strain in Gaza and the West Bank. And the answer to your question is basically no. It cannot start a massive war in the north, continuing what it's doing now in Gaza and the West Bank. Something's got to give. So if it goes into the north, if it can't get a hostage deal in Gaza, it will probably de facto withdraw from Gaza, like it did and concentrate on the north. Hostage deal? I mean, Sinwar is not going to agree if he feels that Israel's dying to get out, because then, you know, why would he agree? He has all the leverage. So that's the most likely outcome there. Would it make a hostage deal more likely? It would make Israel more likely to want it. It would make Sinwar less likely to agree to it. JDB asks me, how do Smotrich, Ben Gvir, and other right-wing elements of Israel's current government compare to the late Meir Kahane? And would he fit into modern Israeli politics? So Smotrich and Ben Gvir are the heirs to Kahane. Without Kahane, you wouldn't have them. He created them. And let me not mince words. Meir Kahane was, and even remains after death, a cancer on Israeli society and on Israeli politics. He is basically the Israeli version of a Nazi. And his heirs, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, are terrorists, racists, anti-democratic forces. They hide it a little bit better than Kahane did. Uh, Ben Gvir is a little bit more ideologically consistent with Kahane, Smotrich is a little bit more all over the place, but ultimately they're heirs of that philosophy. And before Kahane, you didn't really see that much in Israel. Of course, he was charismatic. He had a doctrine that kind of made sense in a way that a lot of Israeli politicians don't, maybe because he's American, was American. And his influence has been malignant, continues to exist. His supporters continue to say Kahane was right. When I grew up in Jerusalem, I used to see Kahane Tzadak, Kahane was right, sprayed on walls everywhere. I remember seeing that all over the day when Rabin was assassinated. These are people who don't mean well for Israel in any sense that fits with the Western world, the liberal world, democracy, common sense, and any kind of decent values. And they're the direct continuation. Would Kahane fit in Israeli politics today? Oh, he would fit really well. He would get so many mandates, and it's terrifying when you think that he got one mandate in the past and he people walked out of the Knesset, including all the people from the Likud, when he talked. That would never happen today. Today, those evil opinions have been legitimized, and that's one of the reasons that Israel is having so much trouble. And it's not just legitimized; it's running the country because Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, which means Kahana, have a veto on Israeli policy, and that is terrifying. So I managed to finish on a bad note, even for such a cheerful episode. But I won't let it ruin my buzz. This operation was a great thing for the families, for the state of Israel, and for the world. And I'm sorry that any innocent Palestinians were killed. Um, hope that we can soon end this war, get rid of Hamas, and move towards peace and coexistence. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon through Trail Media. Also, I have an episode out about King David's court and history of the land of Israel podcast. You may also be interested in recent interviews I did with Ryan Grimm and with Kim Iverson. Um, Especially with Kim Iverson, I did a debate on one state solution versus two state solution, whether Israel has a right to exist, that kind of fun stuff. So you might want to check that out. I'll put the link down below this, and I will see you next time, hopefully again with good news.